The constable arrived within 20 minutes, though it felt considerably longer to those gathered in the parish hall, standing in clusters of shocked silence that was occasionally punctured by nervous murmurs or the sound of someone weeping. Police Constable Edward Morrison was a methodical man of 53 who had served Little Ashford with quiet competence for nearly 30 years, and he moved through the crowd with the solemn authority of someone accustomed to being the bearer of unwelcome certainties. He established a perimeter around the storage room with police tape and sent word to Inspector Graves at the county station, then began the tedious process of taking preliminary statements from anyone who had been near the parish hall when the scream was heard. Miss Marple, having been ushered back outside along with the other villagers, found herself seated once more upon her bench, though now the atmosphere of the harvest festival had transformed entirely. What had been a celebration of abundance had become something altogether different, a gathering infected with the dark knowledge of sudden death. The constable eventually made his way to her, and she received him with her characteristic serenity, offering him a seat beside her on the bench and remarking that the weather seemed likely to turn before evening. Constable Morrison, who had known Miss Marple for decades and harbored a healthy respect for her observations despite her apparent frailty, accepted the offered chair and asked her if she had noticed anything unusual in the moments preceding the discovery. Miss Marple sat down her knitting with careful deliberation and adjusted her spectacles, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. She had seen Sarah Marchmont enter the storage room at approximately 4 o'clock, she recalled, having noticed the young woman's blue shawl disappearing through the doorway while most of the village was occupied with the raffle. She had not observed who, if anyone, had followed her, though she did remark that David Ashford had seemed most agitated in the preceding quarter hour, and that Thomas Whitmore had excused himself from the refreshment area at around the same time. The constable made careful notes, and Miss Marple could see him mentally cataloguing these small details, though she suspected they might lead him toward conclusions that were not entirely accurate. She had learned long ago that the most obvious suspect was frequently innocent, particularly in small villages where resentments and rivalries often provided sufficient motive for suspicion, even in the absence of actual culpability. By the time Inspector Graves arrived from the county station at 5:30, accompanied by a young sergeant and a police photographer, the autumn sun had already begun its descent toward the horizon, casting the churchyard in shades of amber and a deep shadow that seemed somehow appropriate to the occasion. Inspector Graves was a man of perhaps 60, with graying temples and the weathered appearance of someone who had spent a career examining the darker impulses of human nature, and he conducted himself with a brisk efficiency that suggested this was merely one more case among countless others, though Miss Marple detected beneath this professional demeanor a certain methodical intelligence that commanded respect. He established himself in the vicar's study and began conducting formal interviews with the suspects and witnesses, starting with those who had been closest to the parish hall when the scream occurred. Thomas Whitmore was questioned first, and Miss Marple observed from her bench as he was led inside, noting how his left leg seemed to trouble him as he walked, causing him to favor his right side in a manner that spoke of either recent injury or chronic pain that had been exacerbated by stress. When he emerged nearly 40 minutes later, his face had taken on a grayish pallor, and his hands trembled noticeably as he lit a cigarette with shaking fingers. David Ashford followed, and his interview lasted even longer, nearly an hour, and when he finally emerged, there was a defiant anger in his expression that seemed to mask something deeper, a kind of fear that manifested in the aggressive set of his shoulders and the forceful way he declined the cup of tea offered to him by Mrs. Hartwell. Mrs. Eleanor Ashford was summoned at 6 o'clock, and Miss Marple observed with quiet interest how the older woman's demeanor changed the moment she entered the vicar's study. Her usual composed authority seemed to crumble slightly, replaced by something more vulnerable and frightened. By the time she emerged, her face had resumed its customary expression, but her hands were clasped tightly together, the knuckles white with tension. As darkness fell across the churchyard and the temperature dropped with the sudden inevitability of approaching autumn, Inspector Graves emerged from the study and announced that preliminary investigations suggested Sarah Marchmont had been struck repeatedly with what appeared to be a blunt instrument, likely a decorative brass candlestick that was missing from the storage room's shelving. Given the nature of the injuries and the apparent lack of struggle, he suggested that the killer had likely been someone the victim knew and trusted, someone who had approached her without arousing suspicion. He revealed that Sarah's handbag, found beside her body, contained a series of letters written in a careful hand, letters that seemed to reference past events and suggested some form of blackmail or coercion. These letters, though not yet fully examined, appeared to imply that Sarah had possessed knowledge dangerous to someone in the village, knowledge that had seemingly justified her murder in the killer's troubled mind. As the inspector made these pronouncements, Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their familiar clicking, though her mind was working at a pace that belied her outward appearance of serene detachment, connecting threads of observation and inference into a pattern that she sensed was not yet complete, but was nonetheless beginning to reveal its darker design. The discovery of the letters sent a ripple of consternation through Little Ashford that proved far more unsettling than the murder itself. For while a sudden act of violence could be attributed to passion or momentary madness, the suggestion of blackmail introduced an element of calculated malice that seemed incompatible with the village's carefully cultivated sense of respectability. Inspector Graves, recognizing that the letters constituted crucial evidence, retired to the vicar's study with Constable Morrison to examine them more thoroughly, while the remaining villagers dispersed into the gathering darkness, most returning to their homes with the uncomfortable awareness that one among them harbored secrets dark enough to justify murder. Miss Marple remained in the churchyard even as the evening deepened, her cardigan now inadequate against the chill that descended with the fading light, though she seemed unconscious of any discomfort. Her attention focused instead on the patterns of movement and conversation occurring around her. She observed how David Ashford lingered near the church entrance, seemingly unwilling to depart, and how he watched his aunt, Mrs. Eleanor, with an expression that shifted between anger and something approaching regret. She noted the peculiar solitude of Thomas Whitmore, who sat upon a distant bench with the absorbed attention of someone lost entirely in private thoughts, his injured legs stretched before him with apparent unconcern for the surrounding chaos. Most interesting of all, Miss Marple observed the behavior of the vicar's wife, Margaret Thornton, who had been seen in quiet conversation with Sarah Marchmont on at least 2 occasions during the festival. Conversations that seemed to involve some urgency or distress, judging by the way Margaret's hands had clutched at her handkerchief and the manner in which her eyes had darted about as though fearful of being observed. By 8 o'clock, Inspector Graves had completed his preliminary examination of the letters and emerged from the study with an expression that suggested his investigation had taken on considerably more complexity than a simple crime of passion might warrant. He gathered the principal suspects and witnesses, David Ashford, Thomas Whitmore, Mrs. Eleanor Ashford, Margaret Thornton, and a handful of others who had been present at the festival, and announced that while the initial findings remained preliminary, the evidence suggested that Sarah Marchmont had possessed information relating to events that had occurred some years prior, information that appeared to involve at least 2 individuals within the village. He would not elaborate on the specific contents of the letters, maintaining that such disclosure might compromise the investigation, but he made clear that anyone with knowledge of Sarah's background, her connections to the village, or her reasons for taking residence in Little Ashford should come forward voluntarily. The announcement hung in the cool night air like a threat, and Miss Marple sensed the subtle shift in the villagers' demeanor, the protective closing of ranks that occurred in small communities when outsiders threatened to expose their carefully guarded secrets. By the following morning, the story had begun to circulate through the village with the inevitable distortions that occur when factual information passes through multiple retellings, and Miss Marple learned through the usual channels: her daily visit to the post office, her conversation with the baker's wife, her attendance at the morning service. That Sarah Marchmont was now understood to have been involved in various unsavory activities, ranging from blackmail to illicit affairs, depending on whose version one accepted. The official narrative suggested by Inspector Graves seemed to be that Sarah had threatened to expose some long-buried scandal, and that someone in the village, driven to desperation by this threat, had murdered her in a moment of panic. What struck Miss Marple, however, was not what the village was saying, but rather what certain individuals were refusing to say, and she found herself paying particular attention to the careful neutrality maintained by Mrs. Eleanor Ashford, who continued her daily routines with an almost theatrical composure that suggested considerable effort was required to maintain her usual demeanor. On the afternoon following the murder, Miss Marple made a deliberate visit to Mrs. Ashford's residence, ostensibly to inquire about a recipe for damson jam that she had heard the older woman had perfected, though her actual purpose was to observe the environment in which David Ashford lived and to note the small details that might illuminate the relationships within the household. She found Mrs. Eleanor in her garden, pruning the roses with the same methodical precision she applied to everything in life, and she noted how the older woman's hands trembled slightly as she made each cut, and how her eyes seemed to focus on Miss Marple with an intensity that suggested considerable anxiety beneath her composed exterior. They spoke of gardening and recipes, of the unfortunate circumstances surrounding Sarah's death, and of how such tragedies seemed increasingly common in modern times, though Miss Marple detected in Mrs. Eleanor's responses a careful selection of topics to pursue and topics to avoid. Most tellingly, when Miss Marple happened to remark that it must be difficult for David to endure such scrutiny from the police, given his unfortunate tendency toward nervousness, Mrs. Eleanor's pruning shears had frozen mid-motion, and a long silence had stretched between them before the older woman had resumed her work with renewed vigor. As Miss Marple walked home through the late afternoon light, her knitting bag clutched against her cardigan, she found herself considering the peculiar nature of family loyalty and the lengths to which people would go to protect those they loved from the consequences of their own indiscretions. She was beginning to suspect that the truth of Sarah Marchmont's murder lay not in any simple conflict between the victim and a single killer, but rather in a complex web of relationships and secrets that had tangled around multiple inhabitants of Little Ashford, and that unraveling this skein would require considerable patience and an understanding of human nature that extended far beyond the limited forensic evidence that had thus far captured Inspector Graves's attention. The morning of the third day following Sarah's murder brought with it a chill that seemed to penetrate the very fabric of Little Ashford, and Miss Marple found herself sitting in the parlor of the village library, ostensibly to return a book, but more genuinely to examine the space where Sarah Marchmont had worked and lived during her brief tenure in the village. The library was a modest establishment, housed in a converted Victorian cottage, and it bore the unmistakable imprint of Sarah's organizational efforts. The books were arranged with meticulous precision. The cataloguing system had been updated from the chaotic methods employed by her predecessor, and there were subtle touches of elegance in the way the reading room had been reorganized to maximize natural light and comfort. Miss Marple ran her fingers along the spines of the volumes, noting which categories seemed most worn from use, which books bore the evidence of frequent consultation, and she found herself drawn to a section devoted to local history, where several volumes concerning the county's past had been pulled from their shelves and bookmarked with careful precision. Among these was a history of the village dating back to the Victorian era, and as Miss Marple withdrew it from the shelf, a small envelope fell into her lap, unmarked, but containing what appeared to be a photograph of considerable age. The image showed 3 young people standing before a manor house that Miss Marple recognized as Ashford Hall, the ancestral home of Eleanor Ashford's family, though the photograph must have been taken at least 30 years prior, when the subjects were considerably younger. One figure was clearly Eleanor herself, unmistakably identifiable despite the passage of decades, standing beside a man whom Miss Marple did not initially recognize, and beside them stood a young woman whose features bore a striking resemblance to Sarah Marchmont. The librarian, a mousy woman named Miss Catherine Wells, who had taken charge of the library following Sarah's death, appeared in the doorway with an expression suggesting she had not authorized Miss Marple's investigation of the books, though her protest remained unspoken, constrained by the respect due to someone of Miss Marple's standing in the village. Miss Marple, moving with her characteristic unhurried grace, replaced the photograph in the envelope and returned it to the book, asking Miss Wells with apparent innocence whether she had any knowledge of Miss Marchmont's background or family connections. Miss Wells seemed flustered by the question, her hands fidgeting with the edge of her cardigan, and she admitted that Sarah had rarely spoken of her past, maintaining a professional distance that discouraged personal inquiry. However, Miss Wells continued, there had been one occasion when Sarah had received a visitor, a woman of perhaps 60, with silver hair and features that suggested a family connection, though Sarah had not introduced her or explained the nature of their relationship. The visit had occurred approximately 3 weeks prior to the murder, and Sarah had seemed considerably distressed afterward, refusing to discuss what had transpired during the conversation. Miss Marple thanked Miss Wells for this information and departed the library with the photograph now safely retained in her knitting bag, her mind working through the implications of this small discovery. As she walked through the village toward her cottage, she allowed herself to consider the possibility that had begun to form during her conversations with Mrs. Ashford and her observations of David's peculiar nervousness. If Sarah Marchmont was indeed connected to the Ashford family through some past relationship, then the blackmail letters mentioned by Inspector Graves took on an entirely different character. They might not represent malice, but rather a plea for acknowledgement, a desperate attempt by someone seeking to reclaim or reveal a truth that had been deliberately obscured. By afternoon, Miss Marple had decided that direct inquiry into the village's archives might prove illuminating, and she made her way to the cottage occupied by Mr. Harold Finch, the village historian, a retired schoolmaster of 72, who maintained an extensive collection of documents relating to Little Ashford's history. Mr. Finch received her with the enthusiasm he reserved for those who appreciated his scholarly pursuits, and he readily produced a series of photographs and documents relating to the Ashford family's history. Among these were marriage records, birth certificates, and old newspaper clippings, and Miss Marple found herself examining with particular interest an announcement from a London newspaper dated approximately 35 years prior, which noted the stillbirth of a daughter to Eleanor Ashford's younger sister Margaret at a private nursing home in Hampshire. The announcement was circumspect in its details, as was customary for such matters, but it was the handwriting in the margin of the clipping that caught Miss Marple's attention. A notation in what appeared to be Mr. Finch's own hand, suggesting that the child had not, in fact, been stillborn, but had been adopted privately, the adoption concealed to preserve family propriety. When Miss Marple inquired as to the source of this information, Mr. Finch seemed reluctant to elaborate, suggesting only that village gossip from decades prior often proved unreliable and that he had included the notation primarily as a reminder to verify the story before including it in any formal historical documentation. However, he did acknowledge that Eleanor's sister, Margaret, had left Little Ashford shortly after the supposed stillbirth and had subsequently severed her connections with the village entirely, relocating to London, where she had apparently lived a quiet, retired life before her death some 15 years prior. As Miss Marple walked home through the gathering dusk, the pieces of the puzzle began to form a pattern that was troubling in its implications, suggesting that Sarah Marchmont's arrival in Little Ashford had not been entirely coincidental, that her presence represented the emergence of a truth that certain inhabitants had invested considerable effort in concealing, and that her murder might have been motivated not by malice but by a desperate attempt to preserve a secret that threatened to unravel the carefully constructed fabric of respectability that the village had maintained for decades. Inspector Graves convened a meeting with the principal suspects on the fourth day following the murder, summoning David Ashford, Thomas Whitmore, Mrs. Eleanor Ashford, and Margaret Thornton to the vicar's study for what he described as a clarification of certain inconsistencies in their statements. Miss Marple attended this gathering in her capacity as a concerned villager, though the inspector seemed indifferent to her presence, regarding her as merely another elderly member of the community seeking satisfaction that justice would be served. The session began with a review of the timeline established on the day of the murder, and Inspector Graves produced a detailed account of each person's movements during the critical hour between 3 and 4 o'clock when the murder appeared to have occurred. He noted several discrepancies between the statements initially provided and the recollections of other witnesses, and he pressed each suspect with methodical persistence regarding these contradictions. David Ashford admitted, somewhat reluctantly, that he had spoken with Sarah Marchmont on the morning of the festival, though he maintained that their conversation had been entirely civil and had concerned only the recent acquisitions to the library. Thomas Whitmore, when confronted with the observation that his injured leg had seemed to trouble him more severely than would be consistent with a chronic condition, initially denied any recent injury, but subsequently revealed that he had sustained a fall approximately 2 weeks prior while working in the gardens at Ashford Hall, where he had been employed as a groundskeeper. Mrs. Eleanor Ashford, questioned about her relationship to Sarah Marchmont, maintained steadfastly that she had had no prior acquaintance with the young woman, that Sarah had been unknown to her until her arrival in the village, and that any resemblance between Sarah and members of the Ashford family was merely coincidental. Margaret Thornton, the vicar's wife, seemed increasingly uncomfortable as the questioning progressed, and when Inspector Graves directly asked whether she had seen Sarah Marchmont on the afternoon of the murder, she hesitated noticeably before admitting that she had encountered Sarah briefly near the storage room at approximately 3:15, and that Sarah had seemed distressed and had been carrying a sealed envelope that she had refused to discuss. It was at this juncture that Miss Marple, who had maintained her customary appearance of serene inattention throughout the proceedings, remarked with gentle diffidence that she had observed Mrs. Thornton in conversation with Sarah on at least 2 occasions prior to the murder, and that on one of these occasions Mrs. Thornton had appeared quite agitated, almost as though she were attempting to dissuade Sarah from some course of action. The comment introduced a palpable tension into the room, and Inspector Graves turned his attention more forcefully toward Margaret Thornton, demanding to know the nature of her communications with the victim and whether she possessed knowledge relevant to the investigation that she had thus far failed to disclose. Margaret Thornton began to weep, her carefully maintained composure finally fracturing under the weight of the inspector's scrutiny, and through her tears she confessed that Sarah Marchmont had approached her several weeks prior with a proposition that had initially seemed reasonable but had gradually revealed itself to be profoundly troubling. Sarah had claimed to possess information concerning an adoption that had occurred approximately 35 years prior, an adoption that involved a member of Mrs. Thornton's extended family, and she had suggested that the child in question deserved to know the truth regarding her origins. Margaret had attempted to persuade Sarah to abandon this course of action, arguing that the revelation would cause immense harm to innocent people, that the adoption had been conducted with careful attention to the legal requirements of the time, and that dredging up such ancient history served no constructive purpose. Sarah, however, had seemed determined to proceed, and she had hinted that if Margaret would not facilitate her access to Eleanor Ashford, she would approach Eleanor directly with her claims, complete with whatever documentary evidence she had managed to accumulate. As Margaret spoke, David Ashford rose abruptly from his chair, his face flushed with anger and something approaching anguish, and he declared that he had known nothing of these communications, that he had been entirely unaware of Sarah's intentions regarding his family, and that his previous statements to the police had been truthful insofar as they extended. Eleanor Ashford remained silent throughout this revelation, her face a mask of composure so absolute that it seemed to have congealed into something almost sculptural, though her hands, folded precisely in her lap, trembled with barely suppressed emotion. Thomas Whitmore, observing this scene with the expression of someone watching a tragedy unfold according to some predetermined script, shifted uncomfortably in his chair and adjusted the weight distribution on his injured leg with a wince that suggested the injury was causing him considerable pain. Inspector Graves, recognizing that the investigation had entered a new phase, declared that further interviews would be necessary and that all parties present were to remain available for continued questioning. As the group dispersed from the vicar's study into the late afternoon light, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the curious nature of family loyalty and the terrible choices that arise when the preservation of social respectability comes into conflict with fundamental truths regarding identity and belonging. She recognized in the situation elements that were familiar from her long observation of human nature in all its complexity. The way past actions ripple forward through time, the manner in which secrets accumulate their own gravitational force, and the tragic inevitability with which hidden truths eventually demand to be acknowledged, often at considerable cost to those who have invested their lives in concealment. The evening following Margaret Thornton's revelation brought with it a peculiar quality of tension that seemed to permeate the very atmosphere of Little Ashford, as though the village itself had become aware that its carefully maintained facade of respectability was beginning to crack under the pressure of accumulated secrets. Miss Marple sat in her cottage, her knitting needles working their familiar rhythm, though her mind was occupied with the complex web of relationships and motivations that had begun to emerge from the investigation. She found herself reviewing every conversation, every gesture, every carefully chosen word that the suspects had offered during the interrogations, and she recognized patterns that seemed to suggest a narrative quite different from the one Inspector Graves appeared to be constructing. The inspector's theory, based upon the available evidence and the confessions extracted during questioning, seemed to center upon David Ashford as the likely murderer, a young man driven to violence by the threat that his carefully constructed identity and social standing might be undermined by the revelation of an adoption within his family that he had not previously acknowledged. The motive appeared clear, the opportunity had been established, and David's nervous disposition and initial evasiveness regarding his movements on the day of the murder seemed to support this conclusion. Yet Miss Marple found herself troubled by certain aspects of this theory, small inconsistencies that gnawed at her understanding of the situation with the persistence of an itch that could not quite be scratched. She recalled, with particular clarity, the expression that had crossed David's face when Eleanor had remained silent throughout Margaret's confession. Not the expression of guilt or fear that might be expected from someone who had committed murder to protect family secrets, but rather the expression of someone who had been betrayed. Someone who felt the weight of adult deceptions and loyalties that had been kept from him without his knowledge or consent. By the following morning, Miss Marple had resolved to conduct her own investigation into certain aspects of the case that seemed to have escaped the inspector's attention, and she began by paying a visit to the parish records maintained by the vicar in the vestry of St. Mary's Church. The vicar, a man named Thornton who had served the village for nearly 20 years, proved willing to grant her access to the historical documents, and Miss Marple spent several hours examining birth records, marriage certificates, and other documentation that might shed light upon the adoption that had occurred so many decades prior. What she discovered was illuminating in its absence. There was no formal record of Sarah Marchmont's birth in Little Ashford or in any of the surrounding villages, no baptismal entry that would confirm her arrival into the community as a legitimate infant, and no documentation that would support any claim that she possessed family connections to the Ashford lineage. However, she did locate a marriage record from 35 years prior, documenting the union of Margaret Ashford to a gentleman named Charles Thornton, and cross-referencing this with the vicar's own records revealed that Margaret Ashford had subsequently given birth to a daughter approximately 9 months following the marriage. The child, according to the baptismal record, had been named Sarah Margaret Thorne, though a notation in the margin suggested that the entry had been added retrospectively. and the handwriting bore the unmistakable characteristics of ecclesiastical practice that predated the vicar's tenure by several years. As the implications of this discovery began to crystallize in Miss Marple's mind, she found herself considering the possibility that had hovered at the periphery of her understanding, but which she had hesitated to fully acknowledge. What if Sarah Marchmont, for such appeared to be the name she had adopted upon arriving in the village, was not, as initially supposed, the adopted daughter of Margaret Ashford, but rather the biological child of that union, raised elsewhere and subsequently returned to claim her rightful place within the family? If this were the case, then the narrative of the murder transformed entirely, suggesting motivations and relationships far more complex than a simple matter of preserving family reputation through the silencing of an inconvenient revelation. Miss Marple made her way to the home of Thomas Whitmore that afternoon, ostensibly to inquire about his injured leg and to offer assistance in the form of various herbal remedies and tinctures that she maintained in her cottage, though her true purpose was to observe his domestic circumstances and to note details that might illuminate aspects of his character and relationships that had thus far remained obscure. She found him in his cottage garden, attempting to prune the hedgerows despite the evident pain that the exertion caused him, and she noted with interest that his hands bore calluses and marks consistent not merely with gardening work, but with some other form of labor that required considerable physical strength and precision. When she inquired about his employment at Ashford Hall, Thomas became unusually forthcoming, revealing that he had worked for the Ashford family for nearly 15 years, and that he had observed considerable tension within the household during the months preceding Sarah's arrival in the village. He had witnessed David and Eleanor engaged in heated discussions on several occasions, arguments that seemed to involve matters of significant personal importance, and he had observed Eleanor's increasing distress as the months progressed. Most tellingly, Thomas admitted that Eleanor had approached him approximately 3 weeks prior to the murder, and had asked whether he would be willing to assist in conducting certain discreet investigations regarding a person who had recently come to reside in Little Ashford. Investigations that Eleanor had suggested might be necessary to protect her family's interests. When Miss Marple asked whether he had complied with this request, Thomas's expression shifted from his customary openness to something more guarded, and he admitted that he had indeed made inquiries, though he had discovered little of consequence beyond confirming that Sarah Marchmont had apparently arrived in the village without any substantive background that could be verified through conventional means, a detail that had struck him as peculiar and suspicious. The revelation that Eleanor Ashford had actively sought to investigate Sarah Marchmont's background introduced a critical complication into Miss Marple's understanding of the case, for it suggested that Eleanor had possessed prior knowledge of Sarah's existence and had taken deliberate steps to ascertain the threat that her arrival in Little Ashford might represent. This was a detail that significantly altered the nature of Eleanor's potential culpability, transforming her from a woman passively defending family secrets into someone who had actively engaged in reconnaissance. And Miss Marple found herself questioning the nature of Eleanor's anxiety and the true extent of what she had feared regarding Sarah's presence in the village. As she walked back through the autumn afternoon toward her cottage, Miss Marple allowed her thoughts to drift toward the peculiar question of motive, for while the investigation had thus far focused upon the preservation of family reputation and the protection of secrets, there existed another possibility that had begun to suggest itself with increasing urgency. The possibility that Sarah's murder had been motivated not by fear, but by something far more primal and immediate, something that related to more recent events and relationships rather than to historical adoptions and 30-year-old scandals. That evening, Miss Marple penned a carefully worded letter to Inspector Graves, suggesting that the investigation might benefit from closer examination of the timeline of events during the week preceding the murder, and specifically asking whether he had conducted interviews with the various tradespeople and service providers who maintained regular contact with the households of the principal suspects. She suggested, with her characteristic diffidence, that sometimes the truth of human motivation revealed itself through small, seemingly insignificant interactions rather than through the grand narratives of family loyalty and social preservation that typically dominated formal investigations. The inspector, receiving this letter the following morning, seemed initially dismissive of Miss Marple's suggestions, regarding them as the well-meaning but ultimately unhelpful interference of a concerned elderly citizen. However, Constable Morrison, who had maintained cordial relations with Miss Marple throughout his career and who harbored considerable respect for her observations, persuaded the inspector to at least conduct the suggested interviews, and it was through this routine inquiry that a new and unexpected detail emerged. The baker's delivery boy, a young man named Peter Collins, recalled having made a delivery to Ashford Hall on the morning of the murder, and he mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that he had observed Thomas Whitmore departing from Eleanor Ashford's study through a side entrance at approximately 10 o'clock in the morning, and that Thomas had appeared quite agitated, his face flushed and his demeanor suggesting that some significant conversation or confrontation had just concluded. When pressed for additional details regarding the nature of this apparent conflict, Peter recalled that Eleanor had summoned him to the kitchen afterward and had instructed him to ensure that certain deliveries to the cottage occupied by Thomas Whitmore should be directed to her account rather than to Thomas's personal finances, a request that had struck the young man as unusual and suggestive of some form of financial arrangement or obligation. This information, when conveyed to Miss Marple through her network of village contacts, crystallized several previously disconnected observations into a pattern that began to resemble a coherent narrative. Miss Marple recognized that she had been, like Inspector Graves, focusing her attention upon the wrong set of relationships and motivations, and that the true nature of Sarah's murder likely involved considerations far more immediate and visceral than historical family secrets could account for. She made a decision to conduct a final interview of her own, and she sent word to Thomas Whitmore that she would appreciate his company for tea on the following afternoon, suggesting that they might discuss his injury and the various remedies that might alleviate his suffering. Thomas accepted the invitation with what appeared to be genuine warmth, though Miss Marple detected beneath his cordial acceptance a thread of anxiety, as though he recognized that her seemingly innocent social gesture might conceal a more probing purpose. When Thomas arrived at her cottage the following day, Miss Marple observed him with the full concentration of her formidable observational powers, noting every gesture, every hesitation, every involuntary expression that crossed his weathered face as they sat in her parlor, consuming tea and Victoria sponge. She began by inquiring about his injury with genuine solicitude, and Thomas explained that he had fallen while working on the grounds at Ashford Hall, tumbling from a ladder while attempting to repair guttering on the upper story of the house. However, when Miss Marple expressed surprise that such a fall would have resulted in an injury severe enough to require him to favor his right leg so noticeably, Thomas's composure wavered slightly, and he admitted with evident reluctance that the injury was perhaps more recent than the timeline he had previously provided, that it had actually occurred on the afternoon of the festival, during the chaotic moments following the discovery of Sarah's body. As Miss Marple pressed him gently regarding this discrepancy, Thomas finally confessed, his voice trembling with emotion, that he had indeed been injured on the day of the murder, and that the injury had resulted from a fall that had occurred in the storage room where Sarah had been found. He explained, haltingly and with obvious distress, that he had entered the storage room to retrieve certain items for the festival refreshment tent, and that he had discovered Sarah already lying on the floor, apparently injured or deceased. In his shock and confusion, he had attempted to assist her, had slipped on the blood pooled about her body, and had fallen heavily, striking his leg against the edge of a heavy wooden shelf. Terrified that he might be blamed for her death, and uncertain of what had actually transpired, he had fled the room without raising an alarm, and had subsequently remained silent regarding the true nature of his injury, fearing that revelation would inevitably invite suspicion. Miss Marple listened to Thomas's confession with the patient attention of someone accustomed to receiving uncomfortable truths, and she recognized in his account the voice of essential honesty, the testimony of a man who had been frightened and confused rather than guilty of deliberate deception regarding the murder itself. However, his revelation regarding the circumstances of his injury and his subsequent silence created a significant complication, for it meant that the timeline established by the investigation required substantial revision, and that the events of the afternoon had unfolded in a manner quite different from what had been initially theorized. She questioned Thomas with gentle persistence regarding what he had observed when he first entered the storage room, what details he could recall regarding Sarah's condition and position, and whether he had noticed any indication of who might have been responsible for the violence that had evidently been inflicted upon her. Thomas described finding Sarah lying upon the cold stone floor, her blue shawl soaked with blood, her head turned at an angle that suggested severe trauma, and he recalled with painful clarity the exact location of a brass candlestick that lay a short distance from her body, its surface dark with what appeared to be dried blood. Most significantly, Thomas remembered that the door to the storage room had been slightly ajar when he had arrived, and that he had detected the faint sound of footsteps retreating rapidly along the corridor leading toward the rear exit of the parish hall. He had hesitated momentarily, torn between the impulse to pursue whoever had fled and the urgent necessity of attending to Sarah's apparent medical emergency. And this hesitation had culminated in his unfortunate fall, which had prevented him from investigating further. The implications of this revised account were profound, for it suggested that Sarah had been murdered sometime during the interval between the establishment of the raffle drawing and Peter's discovery of the body, and that the murderer had still been within or immediately adjacent to the parish hall when Thomas had arrived at the storage room door. Miss Marple asked Thomas whether he recalled the nature of the footsteps he had heard, whether they had belonged to a man or a woman, whether the person had been moving with urgency or with deliberate control. And Thomas considered the question with the gravity it deserved before responding that he believed the footsteps had belonged to a woman, and that the pace had suggested neither panic nor flight, but rather purposeful movement, as though the person had concluded their business in the storage room and was departing in an orderly fashion rather than in desperate escape. Following Thomas's departure, Miss Marple sat alone in her cottage as the afternoon light began its inevitable decline, and she found herself contemplating the terrible irony that had shaped events in Little Ashford. The investigation had proceeded from the beginning with the assumption that David Ashford possessed the strongest motive for murder, that his desire to protect family reputation and to prevent the revelation of painful truths regarding the adoption had driven him to violence. Yet Thomas's revised account suggested an entirely different scenario, one in which the murderer had retained sufficient composure and self-control to depart the scene of the crime in an orderly manner, exhibiting none of the panic or emotional turmoil that might be expected from someone acting under the impulse of sudden passion or fear. This detail pointed instead towards someone who had killed with premeditation and calculation, someone who had achieved some specific objective through violence and who had then withdrawn from the scene with the methodical efficiency of someone concluding a task. Miss Marple found her thoughts returning repeatedly to Eleanor Ashford, to the older woman's investigation of Sarah's background, to her evident anxiety and carefully maintained composure throughout the police interrogations, and to the peculiar financial arrangements she had apparently made on behalf of Thomas Whitmore. She began to consider the possibility that Eleanor's concern had not been directed toward protecting David from shame, but rather toward preventing some revelation regarding her own past actions or decisions, secrets that she had perhaps carried with her for decades and which Sarah's arrival in Little Ashford had threatened to expose. On the following morning, Miss Marple requested an interview with Inspector Graves, and she presented to him the information that Thomas Whitmore had provided during their private conversation, along with her own observations regarding certain inconsistencies in the established timeline and the nature of the murderer's apparent emotional state at the moment of departure from the storage room. The inspector, initially resistant to this revised analysis, gradually recognized the validity of Miss Marple's reasoning, and he authorized a new round of interviews focused specifically upon the movements and activities of the female members of the suspect pool during the critical period. It was during this renewed investigation that a crucial detail emerged. Margaret Thornton, when questioned regarding her precise movements during the half-hour preceding Sarah's body being discovered, admitted that she had been absent from the main area of the festival grounds, having withdrawn to a quiet corner of the parish hall to compose herself following her distressing conversations with Sarah regarding the adoption. However, she had subsequently revised this account when confronted with the testimony of the baker's boy, who recalled seeing a woman matching Eleanor Ashford's description hurrying along the corridor, leading to the storage room at approximately 4 o'clock, the precise moment when the murder appeared to have occurred. Eleanor, when confronted with this evidence and with the various other inconsistencies that had emerged through careful investigation, initially maintained her protestations of innocence, her composed exterior remaining intact even as the weight of accumulated circumstantial evidence seemed to press down upon her with inexorable force. It was Miss Marple herself who requested the opportunity to conduct a final conversation with Eleanor Ashford, a request that Inspector Graves granted with evident skepticism, but which he seemed willing to accommodate in the spirit of allowing the elderly woman to satisfy her curiosity regarding the case. The meeting took place in Eleanor's sitting room on the afternoon of the 8th day following Sarah's murder, and Miss Marple arrived bearing a carefully selected gift, a tin of the finest Darjeeling tea, a choice that she had calculated with precise intention, knowing that Eleanor maintained exacting standards regarding such matters, and that the gesture would establish an atmosphere of civility rather than accusation. Eleanor received her with the courtesy that social convention demanded, though her grey eyes bore the particular hollowness of someone whose carefully constructed facade of composure had begun to show signs of fracture beneath its polished surface. They sat in the drawing-room, where afternoon light filtered through damask curtains, and Miss Marple began with observations of an entirely innocuous nature. Remarks regarding the quality of Eleanor's rose garden, the elegance of her furnishings, the evident care with which she maintained her household. It was only after several minutes of this deliberately desultory conversation that Miss Marple shifted the direction of her inquiry with a subtlety so profound that Eleanor might not have noticed the transition had she been less alert to the implications of seemingly casual observation. Miss Marple remarked that she had always found it remarkable how certain individuals possessed the capacity to maintain emotional control even under the most trying of circumstances, and that she had observed this quality particularly in individuals who had spent decades perfecting the art of concealing their true feelings beneath layers of social propriety. She continued with gentle persistence that such individuals often carried within themselves profound reservoirs of pain and regret, emotions that accumulated over years and which occasionally found expression in unexpected and tragic ways. Eleanor's hands, which had been folded with apparent composure upon her lap, began to tremble slightly, and Miss Marple observed with clinical precision the exact moment when the older woman's carefully maintained control began to deteriorate. Miss Marple then posed a series of seemingly innocent questions regarding Eleanor's relationship with her sister Margaret, the circumstances of Sarah's birth and subsequent adoption, and the nature of the correspondence that had allegedly passed between Sarah and various members of the Ashford household during the months preceding the murder. With each question, Eleanor's composure fractured further, until finally, with a sound that resembled a confession more than a deliberate utterance, she admitted that she had indeed encountered Sarah in the storage room on the afternoon of the festival, and that the meeting had been anything but accidental. Sarah had sent Eleanor a message requesting a private conversation, claiming to possess information that Eleanor would find compelling regarding the true circumstances of her sister Margaret's departure from Little Ashford 35 years prior. Eleanor, driven by a terrible curiosity and by the fear that Sarah's presence in the village represented a threat to the family's carefully preserved reputation, had agreed to this meeting, and she had made her way to the storage room expecting to conduct a discreet negotiation regarding Sarah's silence. However, upon arriving at the designated location, Eleanor had discovered that Sarah possessed considerably more information than she had anticipated, and that the young woman's intentions were not merely to extract payment for her silence, but rather to force recognition of a truth that Eleanor had spent decades attempting to suppress. Sarah had revealed that she was indeed the biological daughter of Margaret Ashford, born out of wedlock during a period when such circumstances represented a profound scandal within families of social standing. Margaret had been sent away to bear the child in secret, and the infant had been placed in the care of a distant relative, a family from Devon who had raised her as their own daughter. However, Sarah had discovered the truth regarding her origins approximately 2 years prior, and she had spent the intervening time researching her family history and locating the members of the Ashford household. Her arrival in Little Ashford had not been coincidental, but rather the culmination of a carefully planned campaign to reclaim her rightful place within the family and to force Eleanor to acknowledge the circumstances of her birth. Eleanor confessed that the revelation had filled her with a complex mixture of emotions: shame regarding the family's treatment of Margaret, guilt over decades of denial and concealment, and a terrible fear that the truth would destroy David's prospects and Eleanor's own standing within the village. Most damningly, Eleanor admitted that when Sarah had suggested she intended to proceed with public revelation of the adoption regardless of Eleanor's protests or attempts at negotiation, something within Eleanor had shattered, and she had acted with a violence that seemed to arise from some primal source entirely divorced from her conscious will or deliberate intention. She had reached for the brass candlestick that lay upon the storage room shelf, a decorative object that had stood in that location for years, and she had struck Sarah repeatedly, her action driven by desperation and furor rather than by any rational calculation of consequence or outcome. The confession hung in the afternoon air, like a poison, and Miss Marple observed Eleanor's face as the reality of what she had done seemed finally to penetrate the layers of denial and rationalization that had sustained her throughout the preceding days. Eleanor wept, not with the theatrical tears of performative remorse, but with the deep, wrenching sobs of someone who has comprehended the full magnitude of her own capacity for violence. And Miss Marple sat in silence, her small frame composed and dignified, bearing witness to the terrible unraveling of a life that had been constructed with meticulous care and which had crumbled in a single moment of uncontrolled passion. Miss Marple rose from her chair with the measured deliberation of someone whose physical form had accumulated the weight of decades, and she made her way to the telephone in Eleanor's hallway, where she placed a call to Inspector Graves, informing him that she had obtained a confession regarding the murder of Sarah Marchmont, and that he should dispatch Constable Morrison to Ashford Hall to take Eleanor into custody. The inspector arrived within the hour, accompanied by his sergeant and by Constable Morrison, who regarded Miss Marple with an expression that mingled gratitude with a certain melancholy understanding that the resolution of the case would bring little satisfaction to anyone involved. Eleanor did not resist her arrest, and she submitted to the procedures of being formally charged with the murder of Sarah Marchmont with a kind of resigned acceptance that suggested she had perhaps anticipated this outcome from the moment she had first struck the fatal blow. As the police car departed from Ashford Hall, bearing Eleanor away toward the county station where she would be processed and formally interrogated, Miss Marple found herself reflecting upon the terrible ironies that had shaped the events in Little Ashford, how the very secrets that Eleanor had sought to protect through violence had instead been revealed through the mechanisms of justice and investigation, and how David Ashford would be forced to confront the true circumstances of his family's past in a manner far more public and traumatic than any revelation Sarah might have engineered had she survived to tell her story. David, when informed of his aunt's confession and arrest, experienced a kind of profound shock that transcended conventional understanding of grief or betrayal, for he was forced simultaneously to confront the knowledge that his aunt was a murderer and to recognize that the family circumstances he had struggled so desperately to protect had been far more complex and morally ambiguous than he had ever imagined. The village of Little Ashford, in the days and weeks following Eleanor's arrest, underwent a transformation both subtle and profound as the inhabitants began to process the revelation that violence and deception had lurked beneath the surface of their quiet community all along. The narrative of the murder that had initially seemed to revolve around questions of family reputation and social standing revealed itself instead to be a tragedy rooted in the failure of compassion and the destructive power of shame. Eleanor's inability to acknowledge and accept the circumstances of Margaret's life had created a legacy of denial that had ultimately culminated in murder. Miss Marple found herself increasingly sought out by various members of the village community who seemed to require her perspective on events, her understanding of the terrible human failings that had led to Sarah's death, and her insight into the ways that good people might commit terrible acts when driven to desperation by circumstances that seemed to threaten the foundations of their world. She received visitors in her cottage with patient courtesy, and she offered her observations with the gentle wisdom of someone who had spent a lifetime observing human nature in all its complexity, acknowledging simultaneously both the culpability of Eleanor's actions and the understandable desperation that had motivated her violence. Margaret Thornton, the vicar's wife, found herself grappling with her own guilt regarding her knowledge of Sarah's intentions and her failure to more forcefully prevent the meeting that had culminated in tragedy. She sought out Miss Marple on an autumn afternoon, and she confessed that she had suspected Eleanor might resort to desperate measures to prevent Sarah from revealing the truth, though she had not anticipated the specific form that desperation might take. Miss Marple listened to Margaret's recriminations with compassionate attention, and she offered the observation that human beings often possess the capacity to foresee catastrophe without possessing the power to prevent it, and that such powerlessness created a kind of moral burden that could be carried but never entirely resolved. Thomas Whitmore, liberated from the suspicion that had fallen upon him and from the necessity of concealing the true circumstances of his injury, found himself reflecting upon his own complicated relationships with the members of the Ashford household who had employed him for so many years. He came to recognize that his silence regarding Eleanor's private investigation of Sarah had represented a form of complicity, a choice to value his employment and economic security above his responsibility to report suspicious behavior to the appropriate authorities. This recognition did not constitute guilt in the legal sense, but it created within him a kind of existential reckoning with the choices he had made and the consequences those choices had carried for others. The trial of Eleanor Ashford took place in the county courthouse during the following winter, and it proved to be a proceeding that attracted considerable attention from the regional press, for the case contained all the elements that journalists found irresistible. Family secrets, questions of social standing, and the revelation that violence could lurk within the most respectable households. The evidence against Eleanor was overwhelming and conclusive, and her conviction was essentially predetermined from the moment she had confessed to Miss Marple and the authorities. However, the trial itself became an occasion for exploring the broader questions that the murder had raised regarding the nature of family loyalty, the destructive potential of shame and concealment, and the ways that historical injustices and moral failures accumulated across generations until they erupted in violence. Eleanor was sentenced to 15 years imprisonment, a sentence that acknowledged both the severity of her crime and the extenuating circumstances of psychological desperation that had motivated it, and she accepted the verdict with a composed dignity that suggested she had found in the resolution of the case a kind of release from the terrible burden of denial that had sustained her for so many years. The winter following Eleanor Ashford's conviction settled over Little Ashford with a peculiar quality of quietude that seemed to acknowledge the village's collective awareness that something fundamental had shifted in the texture of community life, that the comfortable certainties which had previously governed social interaction had been permanently altered by the intrusion of violence and revelation. Miss Marple, entering the final season of her 8th decade with the same composed acceptance with which she had entered every previous phase of her existence, found herself reflecting upon the case with the distance that only time and resolution could provide, recognizing in the tragedy of Sarah Marchmont's murder a pattern that extended far beyond the immediate circumstances of Little Ashford, and that encompassed the broader human tendency toward self-deception and the destructive consequences of attempting to deny fundamental truths about identity and belonging. The village gradually returned to its customary rhythms, though the return was necessarily incomplete, marked by an undercurrent of awareness that the masks of respectability that individuals wore in their daily interactions concealed depths of complexity and moral ambiguity that previous generations might have preferred to leave undisturbed. David Ashford, freed from the suspicion that had shadowed him throughout the investigation, found himself confronting the painful process of reconsidering his relationship with his aunt and of constructing a new narrative regarding his family's history that acknowledged both Eleanor's capacity for violence and the desperate circumstances that had motivated her actions. He eventually established contact with several distant relatives of Sarah's adoptive family, and through these connections he began to piece together the story of his cousin's life. Her childhood in Devon, her gradual discovery of the truth regarding her origins, and the tentative hope she had harbored that the Ashford family might ultimately accept her as a legitimate member despite the scandalous circumstances of her birth. This process of reconciliation with Sarah's memory and with the family history that had been so violently disrupted transformed David's understanding of responsibility and family obligation, and he became an advocate for greater openness regarding adoption and illegitimacy within the village, challenging some of the more rigid social conventions that had previously governed such matters. Margaret Thornton, the vicar's wife, found herself increasingly involved in community welfare work, as though attempting to transform her sense of moral complicity into constructive action on behalf of those in the village who suffered in silence or concealment. She established a confidential counseling service through the church, offering support to individuals struggling with family conflicts or personal crises, and she became known for her compassionate understanding of human frailty and her reluctance to judge others harshly for their moral failings. Miss Marple observed these developments with quiet satisfaction, recognizing in them the kind of personal transformation that occasionally emerged from tragedy when individuals possessed the capacity to learn from their failures and to channel their guilt into constructive purpose. On a cold February afternoon, approximately 4 months following Eleanor's conviction, Miss Marple received a visitor at her cottage. A woman of perhaps 35 with auburn hair and features that bore a striking resemblance to photographs of Sarah Marchmont that had been published in the newspapers covering the trial. The woman introduced herself as Margaret Ashford, a distant cousin of Eleanor's who had read accounts of the murder and who wished to learn more about the circumstances of Sarah's death and the investigation that had led to Eleanor's conviction. Miss Marple invited her into her parlor, and they sat together as the winter afternoon gradually surrendered to darkness, and Margaret Ashford recounted her own journey of discovery regarding her family's history and her gradual understanding of the complex circumstances that had led to Sarah's estrangement from the Ashford household, and ultimately to her tragic death. As Margaret spoke, Miss Marple found herself reflecting upon the case with the wisdom of complete resolution, recognizing that while Eleanor's conviction had provided legal closure to the murder investigation, the deeper truths that the case had revealed regarding human nature, family loyalty, and the destructive consequences of shame and concealment would continue to reverberate through the village and through the lives of all those who had been touched by the tragedy. She recognized that Sarah's death, while a terrible and unnecessary loss, had nonetheless accomplished what Sarah herself had attempted to achieve during her brief time in Little Ashford, the forcing of acknowledgement regarding truths that had been deliberately obscured, the penetration of the careful facade of respectability that had masked complex human realities, and the creation of an opportunity for genuine reconciliation and healing, though at a cost that no one would have chosen to pay. As Miss Marple sat with Margaret Ashford in her cottage, The fire crackling gently in the hearth and the winter night pressing against the windows, she found herself articulating thoughts that she rarely expressed aloud, but which had gradually accumulated throughout her long life of observation. She remarked that human beings possessed a peculiar capacity for creating the very tragedies they most feared through their desperate attempts to prevent them, that the secrets which individuals guarded most fiercely often contained within them the seeds of their own eventual revelation, and that the greatest moral failing was not the commission of specific acts of violence or deception, but rather the failure to recognize one's fellow human beings as deserving of compassion and understanding despite their imperfections and moral failings. Margaret listened to these observations with the attention of someone hearing profound wisdom, and she left the cottage that evening with a deeper understanding not only of the circumstances surrounding her cousin's death, but also of the complex nature of human motivation and the terrible price that families sometimes paid for their attempts to maintain social appearances at the expense of genuine human connection and acceptance. Miss Marple, watching from her window as Margaret's car disappeared into the winter night, returned to her knitting with the familiar clicking of needles that had accompanied her throughout the investigation, reflecting that while little Ashford would never entirely recover from the trauma of Sarah Marchmont's murder, the village had nonetheless been forced to confront fundamental questions about the nature of community, family, and the possibility of redemption through truthfulness and compassionate understanding. The case had resolved itself not with triumphant certainty, but with the bitter-sweet recognition that tragedy sometimes served as the catalyst for necessary transformation, and that the restoration of peace required not the erasure of difficult truths, but rather the courageous acknowledgement of human complexity in all its painful, redemptive, and ultimately tragic manifestation.